Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 5. Dwarves, Dynasties and Dogs. Haldan, king of the Dwarves of the Dark Hills, was killed at the Battle of Geitsbin in the year 41 of the Common Reckoning. His son, Halvor, inherited his throne. Halvor was 13 years old at the time he became king, and was under the care of his aunt Hildegun, who had raised him following the death of his mother, Solveig, who had died several years previously. It seems that, after Solveig's death, Haldan wished to have nothing more to do with his son. Now, it is notable that both Haldan's wife and his elder brother, Hognar, died at the same time. It has always been assumed that these deaths were caused by an infectious disease. One contemporary source lists the symptoms exhibited by Hognar on his deathbed, and notes that Solveig suffered from the same cause. However, a document from the archives of Geitsbin refers to Haldan as wife-slayer. This may simply refer to the deaths of dwarvish women in the lands between South Vale and the Silver Stream at the hands of Haldan's dwarves. Or it may be that a previously unsuspected link exists between the deaths of Hognar and Solveig and the subsequent rejection by Haldan of Solveig's 4-year-old son. What we do know is that following Haldan's demise, his younger brother Hoskar claimed that, as Halvor was a minor, Hoskar should act as regent until Halvor came of age. This claim was rejected by Hildegun, who was supported in this by Bothi, who was the widower of Haldis, Hildegun's younger sister. For a while the threat of civil war loomed, but it appears that the number of dwarves willing to fight for Hoskar was insufficient to support a rebellion, and Hoskar, along with his brother Hord, who was Hogni's youngest son, moved their people to the southwest, to the eastern foothills of the great mountain which they named Unnerskrag in memory of their mother. They mined the hills and farmed the adjacent plains, and acknowledged no rule but their own. Halvor therefore ruled the dwarves of the Dark Hills in peace. His subjects were no longer sent on raids into the lands between South Vale and the Silver Stream, and no new captives from those regions were sent to work his mines. But the existing captives were not released, and they were joined in their forced labour by those of Halvor's subjects who were foolish enough to breach his laws. Elsewhere, these were years of peace and prosperity for the halflings. Their population moved into new territories, further into the lowlands to the northwest, where they founded the settlement of Greenglade, and further down the bank of the Silver Stream to the southwest. Here they founded the settlement of Forkings, so called because it stood a few miles from the point where the turbulent waters of the river Tumblewater, rushing southward from the Twilight Mountains, flowed into the Silver Stream. In the year 56 of the Common Reckoning, Norby died. He was succeeded as king of the dwarves between South Vale and the Silver Stream by his son Nafni. It was during Nafni's reign that his territory began to be known as the Geitsmark. His folk flourished, and dwarvish settlers pushed further west into the bend of the Silver Stream. In the 60th year of the Common Reckoning, the halflings of Forkings sent a message to King Nafni, asking for his assistance. Halfling populations were growing, and the halflings were looking for new territory to cultivate. The uninhabited lands on the far bank of the river Tumblewater were attractive to them for this purpose, but the river was a barrier which the halflings were not able to cross. The message sent by the halflings was as follows. O mighty king, Nafni, son of Norby halfling friend, the halflings of Four Kings wish all blessings upon you. Many of us fought alongside your father at the battle of Geitspin, which brought peace to your folk. We wish to cultivate new lands, but a river stands in our way, and we seek your assistance. We have heard of the great skill of the dwarves in building, and we ask you to build a great bridge over the river Tumblewater, a strong stone bridge, wide enough for 3 carts to cross it abreast, and with a 5-foot parapet at each side, so that halflings can pass back and forth over the river in safety, without having any sight of the treacherous waters. The lands on the far side of the river are rich, and in return for your assistance we will share them with your people, and pay a toll to them whenever a halfling crosses the bridge that you have made. Nafni is reported to have laughed when he received this message, and to have observed that there was no need to build a bridge, when he would be happy to supply the halflings with as many barrels of dwarvish spirits as they could drink. But Nafni's older sister was called Svala, and she had a husband called Hastine, and Hastine said that he would go to Four Kings and build the bridge that the halflings had requested. And so the bridge was built, and it was known as the Dwarf Bridge, and thousands of halflings crossed the Dwarf Bridge and started to clear the forest and farm the land. And Hastine and Svala built a hall on the far side of the Dwarf Bridge, and their people settled around them, and that settlement was also known as Dwarf Bridge. In the year 62 of the Common Reckoning, Nafni died. He left behind him no male heir, only a baby daughter. His younger brother, Grani, became king of the dwarves of the Geitsmark. To return to the Dark Hills, 2 years previously, in the year 60 of the Common Reckoning, Halvor's wife Iri had died. She had borne him no children. A few months later, Halvor's cousin Bodolf, the son of Haldan's sister Haldis, died, leaving a widow, Dalla, and 5 children behind him. Halvor offered Dalla shelter under his roof and adopted her children. He named as his heir Dalla's eldest son, Bothvar. 2 years later Halvor died, and Bothvar was crowned as king of the dwarves of the Dark Hills. But not all of Bothvar's subjects were content with their new king. Some of them whispered that Halvor should not have welcomed Dalla into his house while, as they put it, his wife's corpse was still warm, and that Halvor's uncle, Hoskar, should by right have inherited the throne. The following year, being 63 of the Common Reckoning, Hoskar made his move. He assembled a force of dwarves and marched from Ulleskrag towards the Dark Hills. Some of the dwarves of the Dark Hills came over to his banners, but the majority proved loyal to Bothvar, who marched his spear dwarves south to meet the threat. The 2 armies met at the Battle of White Sheep Ridge, and the victory was won by Bothvar, who thus secured his throne. Hoskar returned to the environs of Ulleskrag, where he continued to rule alongside his younger brother, Hord. But his people were few, and the losses they had suffered in the battle meant that they no longer posed a significant military threat to Bothvar. That is enough for now of dwarves and their petty squabbles. Let us turn to New Lixia. You will recall that in the year 32 of the Common Reckoning, Krantos died and was succeeded as king of New Lixia by his eldest son, Harnan. The younger brother of Harnan was called Dagnos, and Dagnos had 6 sons. The sons of Dagnos were proud and quarrelsome. The eldest son was called Siramos. He married Altair and had 5 children with her before choking on an oyster and dying at the age of 27. The next son was called Bulis. He married Athesia and they had 3 children. The third son was called Korogos. The fourth was Pharos, who died young, aged only 12. The fifth brother was Kylides, and the 6th was Alberos, who was his mother's favourite. 3 years after Siramos died, Dagnos followed him to the grave, and Bulis became head of the family. He attempted to impose his will on his remaining brothers. This caused much resentment among them. At this time New Lixia had grown considerably, and its farmers were pushing inland, clearing the forests on the banks of the great river. In the year 64 of the Common Reckoning, Bulis and Alberos went hunting in those forests, and came across a particularly attractive site for a farm. On his return to New Lixia, Alberos sent some of his servants to claim the site, clear and cultivate it, and construct a farmhouse there. The farm proved fruitful and generated considerable wealth for Alberos. Bulis now asserted that he had been the one who noticed that the land was good for farming, and had mentioned this in passing to Alberos, and that Alberos had therefore stolen the site from him. The brothers nearly came to blows over this, but their mother, Anicia, intervened, and it appeared that Bulis had let the matter pass. In the year 66 of the Common Reckoning, Alberos was at the farm. Bulis paid a visit, and the brothers fought. The outcome was that Bulis was killed, and Alberos was savaged by Bulis' dogs. Alberos recovered, but he was permanently disfigured, and was afterwards known as Dogface. The loss of her second son, and the transformation of her beautiful youngest son into a hideously scarred monster, broke Anicia's heart, and she died later that year. Alberos' remaining brothers, Korogos and Kylides, then turned on him. They produced one of Bulis' huntsmen, who said that Alberos had started the fight by loosing arrows at his brother, and that Bulis had only set his dogs on Alberos in self-defence. Korogos, who was now the head of the family, demanded that Alberos pass the farm over to him, so that he could manage it for Bulis' widow. Alberos refused and produced one of his peasants, who swore that it was Bulis who had started the fight. Korogos and Kylides now declared that if Alberos did not voluntarily relinquish the farm, they would take it by force. And the population of New Lixia was drawn into the argument and started to take sides. For a while there was a real threat of civil war. At this point Harnan intervened. As king, he exercised his right to take personal possession of the contested property. He reminded Korogos and Kylides that it was the king's role to ensure justice was done, and not theirs, and that anyone taking the law into their own hands would be punished. Finally, he announced that the overcrowding in the city was to be reduced by founding a new colony, and that Alberos would lead the colonists. And so, in the 67th year of the Common Reckoning, Alberos Dogface sailed out of New Lixia at the head of a fleet. He travelled east along the coast, past the range of hills known as the Heaps, looking for a suitable site to settle, and as he approached the southwestern extremity of the Goblin Downs, he found an anchorage and an area of fertile coastal plain, and here he came ashore and founded the city that was known as Dogopolis. Harnan had an older sister called Doris, who married a man called Cobon. They had 4 children, the eldest of which was a daughter, who they named Aethra. Aethra grew up and married a man called Irus. They had 3 daughters, Arisbe, Crataeis, and Pero. While these girls were still in their infancy, Aethra died, giving birth to her final child, a son, who was named Theron. After his wife's death, it appeared that Irus focused his attention on Theron and rather neglected his daughters. Rather than spending their time practicing weaving, needlework, and home economics, they seem to have developed skills in archery, fencing, hunting, and other unladylike pursuits. It appears that they were quite content with this state of affairs. In the year 74 of the Common Reckoning, Arisbe was 19, Crataeis 18, and Pero had just turned 16, and Irus decided that it was time for them to get married. He identified as suitable spouses the girls' second cousins, the 3 sons of Cyramos, and entered into negotiations with Cyramos' widow Altaia to arrange this. The negotiations proceeded in a satisfactory manner, and a date was agreed for a group wedding. It was only at this stage that the daughters of Irus were informed of their impending nuptials. For whatever reason, the sisters objected to this plan. Some say that they disliked the sons of Cyramos in particular. Some say they disliked the company of men in general. One scholar has even proposed that they were rebelling against an oppressive patriarchy which treated them as objects rather than agents. Whatever. The fact is that on the wedding day, when the brothers came to escort their brides to the marital altar, they were greeted with spears, swords, and arrows, rather than with kisses. And the outcome was that 2 of the sons of Cyramos were dead before noon. The daughters of Irus understood that there would be trouble coming their way, and chose not to wait for it. They rode off into the sunset to the west, as far as the foothills of the Gap-Tooth Mountains, where they settled, and over time they were joined by other women who found the social hierarchies of New Lixia to be oppressively misogynistic. Thus was the tribe of the Amazons founded. Now, it has been said that the Amazons only went off to live in the hills because they were not interested in the company of men. This is not true. There are many stories of Amazons becoming pregnant. Parties of Amazons would leave their tribal lands to go trading, cattle raiding, hunting, or what have you, and often that involved some contact with men, and then, well, nature would often take its course. But such relationships were of necessity transient, as the Amazons were passionately attached to their tribal land, and no man was allowed within the Amazon lands on pain of death. This may of course explain why the young men of New Lixia would go hunting in the wilderness for a night or 2, taking paths that travelling Amazons were known to frequent, and returning to the city empty-handed, looking tired, but very pleased with themselves.